You are now listening to the Purple Fox Podcast.
Update.
What's going on, everybody? This is Kevin Cieze, your host of the Purple Fox Podcast. And today we're going to be talking about the pros and cons of rent control. Rent control is a topic that is always on the minds of most tenants, especially if you live in a coastal city with an extremely dense population. When I think about this issue, I think of cities like Los Angeles, San Francisco, and New York. Those cities come to mind. In the midst of a possible recession and soaring inflation, it's no wonder rent prices would become top of mind for those living paycheck to paycheck or on the very edge of homelessness. A political article entitled "Happy New Fiscal Year, California, Here's Where Things Get Tougher" lays out the details around the end of the moratorium on rent due during the COVID-19 pandemic. The moratorium, which was previously slated to end on March 31st, was extended because so many people were still waiting on the state to process their applications. The California legislature was concerned people would lose their housing simply because of bureaucratic delays. As tenants rushed to apply for rental assistance, the state doled out a total of about $4 billion of combined state and federal dollars to about 340,000 households. According to Politico, the assistance only covered unpaid rent up through the end of March, so everyone who fell behind in April, May, or June was not protected by this particular moratorium. California's Business, Consumer Services, and Housing Agency stated that all applications had been processed and the money is queued for distribution. There are about 20,000 tenants who received help earlier and are now waiting on supplemental payments, though agencies said risk of eviction is low because the individuals, because in many cases, the landlords are aware that the payment is already on the way. So there's no use evicting your tenant when you know the payment's going to be coming in soon. Most landlords are making up for their lost revenue in rent by hiking rent prices. It would be completely understandable for tenants if we weren't in such an economic trouble as a nation. We weren't in such dire straits in terms of our economy in this nation at the moment. But knowing the national climate is what has me take a serious look at the situation around rent control and what it takes to set reasonable policy around it. David Wagner of the LAist writes that older buildings are more likely to be covered by rent increase caps. Many newer buildings have no limits at all, but laws at both the state and local level exempt recently built properties from annual rent caps. The Costa-Hawkins Rental Housing Act limits the kind of rent control cities can impose on buildings constructed since 1995. And state lawmakers agreed to exempt buildings constructed within the last 15 years from statewide rent caps in order to maintain incentives for developers to build new housing. It seems that many cities use statistical data from our current inflationary rate and the local consumer price index, or CPI, to calculate the rental increase percentages that make sense for the city. According to the Federal Reserve, the current rate of inflation stands at around 9%, a percentage being singled out as the highest in 40 years. Knowing that chilling detail leaves only one other piece of information. If you're a councilman or a woman making rent policy, what you have to consider is the CPI. So what is the CPI? According to Investopedia, the Consumer Price Index, CPI for short, quote, measures the monthly charges and prices paid by U.S. consumers. The Bureau of Labor Statistics, the BLS, calculates the CPI as a weighted average of prices for a basket of goods and services representative of aggregate U.S. consumer spending. end quote. So in English, um, the CPI monitors and records the spending habits of consumers around various goods, noting if consumers are willing to spend either more or less on a given product or type of product. According to David Wagner of LAist, the CPI is one of the most popular measures of inflation and deflation. The CPI report uses a different survey methodology, price sample, and index weights that the producer price index, the PPI, then the producer price index, the PPI. So there's the CPI, the consumer price index, and the PPI, the producer price index. And the PPI, which measures change in the prices received by U.S. producers for goods and services. So how does someone calculate the new price in rent using the consumer price index? First, one has to find the adjustment multiplier. To do that, you have to subtract the current CPI index with the index at the start of your lease, and that's called the base index. After subtracting, you then divide that value by the base index once more. The resulting number is your adjustment multiplier. Now, how do you calculate the new rent price? You'd multiply the total amount of rent you would pay for the year by the adjustment multiplier. From there, you add that new number to the total amount of rent and divide by 12. That number is your new rent price. I'll do an example with Los Angeles County. So on June 30th, 2022, the CPIU was an estimated 314.07. If you renewed your lease right before April 1st, your base index is 306.68. So current subtracted from base will give you 7.39, and you can check this on the website of the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Now divide 7.39 by the base index of 306.68 once more, and that gives you 0.024 or 2%, but leave it as the former for the sake of the equation. From there, you multiply 0.024 by your total rent for the year, add that number to the total rent you currently pay for the year, then divide that by 12 for the 12 months out of the year. Now, you know around roughly, because they don't really have to go at that number, but you know roughly around where your new rent price is, as well as how most cities calculate the rental value using the CPIU. So the question that keeps coming to the surface in the face of these rental price increases is, where are people supposed to live if more and more people keep getting priced out of their rental situation? Most residents of coastal cities haven't seen a wage increase in years, and even those that have received a bump up to $15 an hour still struggle to survive as inflation rages on. Neighbors are plucked from the communities they love. Renters are extremely uncertain about their futures, and the most vulnerable people among us end up inevitably on the street. In the year 2020, nonpartisan researchers at MIT estimated extreme rent control measures like those proposed on the ballot of that year result in an average reduction in home values up to 20%, and can run up to $115,000 in lost value for the average homeowner. And that's undeniable. However, inflation seems to be halting most listing desires on the real estate front, and there are barely any buyers. Most of the anti-rent control crowd argues that rent control takes away basic protections for homeowners and allows regulators to tell single-family homeowners how much they can charge to rent out a single room. The fear is that millions of homeowners will be treated just like corporate landlords, being subjected to regulations and price controls enacted by unelected boards. This makes sense to me. But when I consider that families, teachers, and nurses and others are struggling to find housing due to rent and low wages, seniors and veterans are left with little for food and medical care after paying rent. Small businesses are squeezed as renters spend less in their communities, and workers face longer commutes. Rent control once again appears to be the better option. Living paycheck to paycheck makes it harder for the working class to afford housing in the communities they serve, while still having enough for basic necessities like groceries, gas, childcare. I mean, at the same time, rising rents are leading to a massive surge in the homelessness population. That's just the equation we seem to be seeing play out in front of us. The economic status of any community is always a balancing act, of course. And the goal should never be to completely screw landlords for the sake of renter comfort. But one part of the rent control conversation that most landlords and their advocates forget to address is that renters are currently being screwed. Why is it that they are never the priority? Imagine a community that would have that much disdain for its renting class, which is arguably the lifeblood of the economy, the local economy anyways. I would think it would make sense to take care of them and guarantee that their purchasing power continues to stimulate their local economy. Many communities seem to be getting that message and are actively putting some semblance of rent control in place. Another LAist article by David Wagner has him state the circumstances around the city of Bell Gardens and its city council's unanimous vote to advance a rent control plan that limits annual increases to no more than 4%. According to Martha Pineda, an activist referenced within the article, quote, "To cover rent, most folks will say that they've already talked about cutting down food costs. They've already talked about medicine costs," end quote. Data from Southern California Association of Governments reports that close to 78% of the city's households rent their homes. 78%. Nearly 2/3 of those renter households are considered rent burdened, meaning rent consumes more than 30% of their income. About 1/3 of renters in the city devote more than half of their income to paying rent. Half of their income. Wow. This is the state of our current reality. Even if our affluent populations aren't feeling the sting of the current economic climate, a large majority of the US population is crying out for help. The options presented can often seem hopeless, but with a little aid from those that represent us in local government, we can stop the monetary gouging currently burdening the pockets of a population willing to contribute to the stimulation of local markets. There are clear pros and cons to the issue of rent control. No one's doubting that. But at the moment, and for what seems like the foreseeable future, the logic seems to be on the pro side. What's left to do is to ask your local representatives to side with renters for a change, instead of keeping with the tradition of propping up the business class stakeholders who don't come close to the number of renters in need of assistance. Rent control measures can be implemented along with mortgage relief programs because we cannot forget that landlords may fall into economic trouble when their cash flow doesn't measure up to the demands of their financial obligations. That's a fact. Inflation keeps raging. The supply chains are unraveling. Russia is destabilizing the globe. Fed Chair Jerome Powell continues to raise the interest rates to mitigate the crisis, and we're all caught dead center in the middle. But that doesn't mean we should treat our communities like the private sector. coldly cutting costs and turning a blind eye towards cries for help. It seems like the perfect moment to dig in and make room in the fallout shelter for everyone with a stake in the future of our economy. And that most definitely includes the renter class. So this is your host, Kevin Cieze, with another Purple Fox update. Signing out.